Good morning again. I failed to mention earlier about Fridays, especially First Fridays. I felt compelled to make this short video about First Friday devotion to the Sacred Heart. And it shouldn't matter if you're Catholic or Baptist or Methodist. I think we all should be more and more devoted to Jesus Christ. And if we see it as His Sacred Heart poured out on the cross for love of all of us, then that's okay. And devotion to the Sacred Heart has been around for a long time. In the mid-1600s, there was a lady named Margaret Mary Alacoque. And I'll show you the book that this comes from. St. Margaret Mary. There's the author, and it is a tan book. They do publish a lot of Catholic saint books, and it's about St. Margaret Mary. And what really piqued my interest when I first picked this book up was the very first chapter, where it says, "A troubled household." Her life as a child, she was sickly. People were not the nicest they are to her. And it could be a book written today. So I don't think human nature has changed much in 450 years. Again, she lived around the mid-1600s. And it was about devotion to the Sacred Heart of Jesus. Back in those days in France, it was all about hellfire and damnation. We should fear God. We should fear God. And she started a new thing to where God doesn't want us to fear Him. He wants us to love Him, which to me makes sense. It was a change of thought for the times. And of course, it doesn't go over well because people get stuck in their habits. In the very beginning of the book, it says, "To those who make known and loved the Sacred Heart of Jesus." And then there's a short prayer. Prayer to the Sacred Heart. This is from St. Margaret Mary Alacoque. "O heart of love, I put all my trust in Thee, for I fear all things from my own weakness, but I hope for all things from Thy goodness." There's nothing wrong with that, right? Very pleasant prayer. And then I'll just finish by saying, if you do some research, if you haven't done the 9 First Friday devotions, please consider doing so, and I guarantee you will be lifted up in your spirit. You'll become more devout, more thoughtful as a Christian. So look into it. There are certain promises that go along with it. Some people will say that's superstitious and things like that. Well, let them say what they will. What happens in our heart has nothing to do with what people think or say. It's how God's grace reacts as it touches us and how we respond. So don't give much thought, like Mother Teresa, about what people think. Because in the end, it's not between them and us. It's between us and God. This is the very back of the book. And the promises of the Sacred Heart of Jesus. Maybe Sister Margaret Mary is a saint. Nonsense. The poor young woman has been out of her mind for years. That's a lie. It is not. It is. The gossip in town raged on. The nuns themselves did not know what to think about this sister, who reportedly saw our Lord. Even the superior, Mother Grafey, didn't know what to think. But one day she decided to settle the question once and for all. For some time now, Sister Margaret Mary had been seriously ill. Well, if our Lord would cure her immediately and keep her in perfect health for 5 months, she, Mother Greffy, would have no more doubts about the so-called apparitions, but would work to spread devotion to the Sacred Heart. So off went Mother Greffy to the infirmary, where Sister Margaret Mary lay sick in bed. What was going to happen now? This book gives the answer. It also tells about Margaret's painful days at home, her difficulties in becoming a nun, about St. Claude de la Colombière, about the lonely young Catholic Duchess, and about our Lord's message concerning His Sacred Heart. In short, this is the remarkable story of St. Margaret Mary Alacoque and the wonderful promises of the Sacred Heart of Jesus. I'll share with you a short story about how I became interested in devotion to the Sacred Heart. One day I was in Walmart, and at the end of the aisle in the back of the store was this picture. It was on an end cap. It was completely framed and had a glass cover. It was a beautiful print. And it was at the end just staring at me as I walked down the aisle. And of course it was in amongst other pictures of like flowers and animals and beach scenes and things like that. And I thought, how strange that this picture was just standing there, sitting there at the end, looking at me. Of course, I purchased it. This was close to 20 years ago now. Actually, it was 20 years ago, maybe a little bit more. But that piqued my interest in the Sacred Heart. And that picture remains on my wall even today. You know, it's not always when you're looking for something that we find it. We must keep our hearts and our minds open, for God's grace can touch us at any time and come into our hearts at any time. Well, please consider devotion, or at least thoughts of God's most Sacred Heart of Jesus. With all the information nowadays that's on the internet, it's up to each and every one of us what we research and what we look into. And I believe this book is still available if you look for it. It was printed, this particular one was printed in 1994, but it was first published in 1953. So I just had to mention that it was First Friday, Sorrowful Mysteries and the Rosary. Pretty much every Friday to me, I think of the Sacred Heart, but First Fridays are special. God bless everyone. Keep your thoughts to heaven and have a peaceful Friday.